Okay, so you may have, like I said, some of you may have heard the story before and the general idea, but the purpose here now is to analyze it carefully and see how we take this. We see how we take this concept and analyze it. Here we go. This is the story. I believe this is the second story. Okay, there's two stories, one after the other. Here we go. Apropos tribulations of exile and hope for redemption. The Gemara relates. So here we have a story. The Gemara relates. So remember, the bold is the Talmud, and the not regular words are the commentary. I believe this is the commentary of Rabbi Steinsaltz that you can find on this website, Sefaria, which is a good website in general. They have a lot of resources and a lot of Jewish texts, but in any case, you want to focus mainly on the bold, but I'm going to read everything. And it once was that Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Akiva were walking along the road in the Roman Empire. And they heard the sound of the multitudes of Rome from Puteoli at a distance of 120 mil. In other words, there's so much noise. There's a big city. There's a metropolis. There's so much noise that when they're 120 mil away, they already hear the noise of the city. The city was so large, they were able to hear its tumult from a great distance. And the other sages began weeping. Right? So there's a group of sages, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Azariah, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Akiva. So there are 4 sages walking together. 3 of them start weeping. They start crying. And Rabbi Akiva was laughing. They said to him, the other sages who were crying said to Rabbi Akiva, they said to him, for what reason are you laughing? Rabbi Akiva said to them, and you, for what reason are you weeping? They said to him, these Gentiles who bow to false gods and burn incense to idols dwell securely and tranquilly in this colossal city. And for us, the house of the footstool of our God, the temple, is burnt by fire. And shall we not weep? In other words, the contrast. They were coming from Israel. Israel has been destroyed. The Jerusalem, the house of God, the temple has been burnt to ashes. And that's okay, but when you go and you see that the enemy who destroyed the temple, they're living, and they're who they serve, serving idols, and they're living in peace and tranquility, that causes a tremendous amount of pain. So that's why these other sages tell Rabbi Akiva, that's why we're crying. Rabbi Akiva said to them, that is why I am laughing. If for those who violate his will, the wicked, it is so, and they are rewarded for the few good deeds they performed, for those who perform his will, all the more so will they be rewarded. So Rabbi Akiva says, look, what do we see from here? We see from here, even the wicked who do a few good deeds, I guess the Romans had a few good deeds, they get tremendous reward in this world. They get tremendous reward. So we will learn from this experience and say how much more so we are much more righteous relative to the Romans. We too will be rewarded greatly in the future tense. So you're crying now. You're crying because of what's happening now. I'm laughing because of the future. That is story number 1. Now there's another story which it could not have happened the same day, because that story happened in Rome, 120 mil from the city of Rome. The next story is going to happen in Jerusalem, but it's the same characters, and that's why the Talmud puts both stories together. The Gemara relates another incident involving those sages. On another occasion, they were ascending to Jerusalem after the destruction of the temple. When they arrived at Mount Scopus and saw the site of the temple, they rent their garments in mourning in keeping with halachic practice. Right? Har Hatzofim, Mount Scopus is the mountain from which you can see the Temple Mountain. And the law is that if you have not been in the Temple Mountain, if you have not seen the Temple Mountain for 12 months, and then you see it, you have to tear your garments as a sign of mourning because the temple was destroyed. So they come up to the Temple Mountain, they come up to Mount Scopus, they can already see the Temple Mountain, they tear their garments. When they arrived at the Temple Mount, they saw a fox that emerged from the side of the Holy of Holies, right? It was desolate. There was no building there. So if it's desolate, then it's barren. If it's desolate, then the foxes roam there. So the fox roaming on that territory represents that it's wilderness. It's not settled. So the fox emerges from the site of the Holy of Holies. The site of the Holy of Holies is not just the Temple Mountain, but it's the holiest part of the Temple Mountain. Only the high priest was allowed to go there, and only once a year. They began weeping. Again, when those sages see the fox roaming the site of the Holy of Holies, they start weeping. Same thing, same pattern. And Rabbi Akiva was laughing. They said to him, "For what reason are you laughing?" Rabbi Akiva said to them, "For what reason are you weeping?" They sent him, "This is the place concerning which it is written, and the non-priest who approaches shall die." In other words, even very holy Jews, if you're not a priest, you can't, it's not really a non-priest, bad translation. It says Hazar, the foreigner. It means if you're not a high priest, if you're not a high priest and you come to the Holy of Holies, it's capital crime. So it's such a holy place that the non-priest is not allowed to go there. And now foxes walk in it, and shall we not weep? So they're explaining that they're like, of course we have to cry. This is the holiest place to Judaism. Even holy Jews who are non-priests are not allowed to walk in this territory of the Holy of Holies. Now it's been utterly destroyed, and we have foxes roaming that area. Of course we're going to cry. Now Rabbi Akiva says, how come he has to laugh? But now it gets more complicated. Last time he had a one-liner. This time it gets more complicated. He has to give a whole explanation why he is not crying. So here we go, why he is laughing. Rabbi Akiva said to them, "That is why I am laughing. As it is written, when God revealed the future to the prophet Isaiah, and I will take to me faithful witnesses to attest, Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Yivrachiyahu." That's Isaiah chapter 8:2. That's the verse. The verse is, in other words, God tells Isaiah, I have two prophets who are going to testify to what I am saying. What are the two people? Who are the two people? Uriah and Zechariah. These are going to be the people who will testify to what I'm saying. In other words, in their lifetime, they're going to see what I'm saying comes into fruition. So Rabbi Akiva says we have a big problem here. What is the connection between these two individuals? Now, what is the connection between Uriah and Zechariah? He clarifies the difficulty. Uriah prophesies during the first temple period, and Zechariah prophesies during the second temple period. And he was among those who returned to Zion from Babylonia. In other words, if God is saying, I have two witnesses who will testify, usually two witnesses have to show up in court together. In this case, you have two witnesses, one from the period of the first temple, one from the period of the beginning of the second temple. How do you put the two together? How would these appear? How does God place Uriah and Zechariah together as a team, as a pair? That is the question that Rabbi Akiva is giving. He's giving a sermon. Ask them a simple question. Why are you laughing? But he's a rabbi. So if you want to ask him why I'm laughing, you have to sit around for a class to get the answer. So he starts asking a question. God, here's the verse in Isaiah. Isaiah says God puts forth two witnesses. He puts forth Uriah and Zechariah. So Rabbi Akiva says, what does Uriah got to do with Zechariah? They're in two different periods. One is the first temple, one's in the second temple. So what is the meaning? Rather, the verse established that fulfillment of the prophecy of Zechariah is dependent on the fulfillment of the prophecy of Uriah. It's not that God is saying they're both going to be together in the same time. It means these are two witnesses because both their prophecies, who seem polar opposites, as we will see, are actually dependent on one another. So let's read what those two prophecies are. In the prophecy of Uriah, it is written, therefore, for your sake, Zion, it's not for your sake, biglalchem, because of you, because of your sins, Zion shall be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem shall become rubble, and the Temple Mount as the high places of a forest. That's from Micah, Prophet Micha. But in other words, that's not the end of the verse. The verse the Talmud quotes, and you'll see later this is very significant. Therefore, for your sake, Zion shall be plowed as a field. That's the story of the fox roaming on the Holy of Holies is because it was plowed like a field. In other words, it was not settled. Okay, so that's a terrible prophecy of Uriah. where foxes are found. There was a rabbinic tradition that it was prophesied by Uriah. In the prophecy of Zechariah, it is written, and this is a beautiful, beautiful verse from the book of Zechariah, from the prophet Zechariah. In the book of Zechariah, there shall yet be elderly men and elderly women sitting in the streets of Jerusalem. Right? So the Jerusalem is destroyed. Zechariah says, don't worry, Jerusalem will be rebuilt to the extent. How do you know that Jerusalem is rebuilt? If you have soldiers in the streets, no, that means there's still warfare. That means there's no peace and serenity. But if you have old men and old women sitting in the streets of Jerusalem, then you know that Jerusalem has been rebuilt. There's peace, there's serenity. People come up to old age in Jerusalem, and that's the sign of redemption. Of course, this has been fulfilled in our days. If you go to the old city of Jerusalem Shabbos afternoon, you see many people sitting in the streets. You see young people, you see old people. So this, at least the beginning of the fulfillment. In other words, go back to our subject. We have two prophecies that are unrelated. One prophecy is very negative, Uriah, where Uriah is going to prophesize about the fact that the temple is going to be destroyed, and Zion, which is a temple mountain, is going to be plowed like a field. And then you have another prophecy which says this area, Zion, is going to be rebuilt to the extent that elderly men and women are going to be sitting in the streets of Jerusalem. Go back to the verse in Jeremiah, the verse in Isaiah. The verse in Isaiah says, these two prophets are my witnesses. So Rabbi Akiva says, what these two prophets didn't speak to each other. They didn't live in the same period. Why are you putting them together as a team, as a pair of prophets? So Rabbi Akiva answers, because the Torah is telling you that, and Jeremiah is telling you, God is telling Isaiah that these two prophecies are interconnected and interdependent. What does he mean? So now Rabbi Akiva concludes, until the prophecy of Uriah with regard to the destruction of the city was fulfilled, I was afraid that the prophecy of Zechariah would not be fulfilled, as the two prophecies are linked. Now that the prophecy of Uriah was fulfilled, it is evident that the prophecy of Zechariah remains valid and will be fulfilled. The Gemara ends, and this is the conclusion of the tractate. The sages sent to him, employing this formulation, Akiva, you have comforted us. Akiva, you have comforted us. And that's the conclusion of the tractate. And that's the connection to the Haftarah. It says the language twice, Akiva, you comforted us, Akiva, you comforted us. What did Rabbi Akiva tell them really? What Rabbi Akiva said is you have two prophecies, one's terrible and one is very positive. But then there's another prophet, Isaiah, who says both these prophets are, these two prophecies are my witnesses, and witnesses have to go and appear. So when you say these two prophets are witnesses, you're basically saying they're connected in somehow. How are they connected? One is so negative, Jerusalem will be destroyed and plowed. And one is so positive, saying that Jerusalem will be rebuilt and the elderly men and women will sit in the streets of Jerusalem. Why are they connected? So Rabbi Akiva explains, the bad and the good are connected. If the destruction is so severe, then the rebuilding will be so beautiful and so profound. And therefore, when they come and they see the fox coming out of Jerusalem, when they come and see the fox that is emerging from the Holy of Holies, they see negativity. They see the prophecy of Uriah before their eyes. So they cry. So they ask Rabbi Akiva, how can you laugh? And he says, you see the prophecy of Uriah. I see the prophecy of Zechariah. Now that I see that the negative prophecy has been fulfilled, now I know that the positive prophecy will be fulfilled as well. And that comforted them, and that is the story. Seems like a very wonderful story, a good story to conclude a tractate. But as we will see, once we start thinking about the story, we have many, many questions. And if you want to start unpacking it, there are many difficulties, and this opens up a broad range of a broad discussion. So that's the beginning. That's the first layer of the foundation. We read the story, and now we can start thinking about the questions and what we do with the story. Okay, you ready? We have 8 questions. Some more dramatic than others. We have 8 questions, and what we want to do is we want to go through them at least quickly. In other words, at least address them quickly, and let us see where we do. So that's the next step in our journey. We have the story. That's step 1. Step 2, we want to analyze this, and again, we're going to have 8 questions. Question number 1. When you read that conversation, when you look at this conversation, the strangest part of the conversation is as follows. It's not strange. It's just strange. So they come along the road to Rome, and they heard the sound of the multitudes of Rome, and they began weeping, and Rabbi Akiva was laughing. They said to him, "For what reason are you laughing?" Rabbi Akiva said to them, "And you, for what reason are you weeping?" Okay. So they ask him, "Why are you laughing?" He asks them, "Why are you weeping?" Now, this is a very strange question. Why are you weeping? In other words, who has the explaining to do? It's obvious why you would cry when you see your enemy sitting in peace, right? That is not a question. Why are you laughing is a strange question. Why are you laughing is a legitimate question. So why does Rabbi Akiva, when they ask Rabbi Akiva, "Why are you crying?" When they ask Rabbi Akiva, "Why are you laughing?" Rabbi Akiva has an answer. He says, and this is something you can't, if the people who go against God's will are rewarded in this way, those who follow God's will get much more. Rabbi Akiva has the explaining to do. The other sages who are crying, why are they crying? It's obvious. Because the enemies of the people are sitting unsuccessful while Israel is destroyed. God forbid, if you want equivalent, if you would go and use, okay, I don't want to bring examples, but the bottom line is this: you see your enemy in a state of success. Of course, that causes you pain. So why is it, we understand everything in the story, but why is Rabbi Akiva asking them, "Why are you crying?" Isn't that obvious? They don't have any explaining to do. What they're doing is completely legitimate. What he's doing is the outlier. What Rabbi Akiva is doing, laughing, that's strange, that's unusual, that requires explanation. So that's question number 1. Question number 2. It becomes even more strange, which is really continuation to question number 1. It becomes even more strange when you get to the second story. What happens in the second story? In the second story, they come to Jerusalem. And again, they began to cry. They see the fox coming they see the fox emerging from the Holy of Holies. They began weeping. Rabbi Akiva was laughing. They said to him, "For what reason are you laughing?" Rabbi Akiva said to them, "For what reason are you weeping?" This is even stranger. Rabbi Akiva asks them, "Why are you weeping?" Why is this so strange? You know why it's so strange, even more strange than before? Because earlier in the story, it says, when they arrived at Mount Scopus and saw the site of the temple, they rent their garments in mourning. Who is they? They is everybody. It doesn't say 3 of the rabbis tore their garments, Rabbi Akiva didn't. No, they all tore their garments, meaning Rabbi Akiva also participates in the mourning. And he does an act of mourning. So if Rabbi Akiva himself is actually standing on a temple mountain with a torn garment, or next to the temple mountain, with the torn garments, which means he is participating in the mourning, how is it possible that now he asks his friends, his colleagues, "Why are you crying? Why are you crying? Why did you tear your garment?" Of course we know why we're crying, because the temple was destroyed. So the question 2 is really the same point of question 1, but the question 2, it makes it even more stronger, because in the second story, Rabbi Akiva himself participates in the mourning, and yet he asks them, "Why are you crying?" Isn't it obvious? You yourself also mourned. You yourself also tore your garments. So question 2 sort of is the same theme of question 1, but highlights the question even more. Okay, now I made a little mistake when I read it. They were right. I said their translation was wrong, but their translation was right. When they explain why they're crying, they evoke a verse that says, they said to him, this is the place concerning which it is written, "And a non-priest who approaches shall die." And now foxes walk in it, and shall we not weep? Okay, what's the theme of that verse? The theme of that verse, if you look in Numbers, is that verse says, anyone who is not a priest may not perform service in the entire temple. That's a wonderful verse. But you see, I got tripped up. I thought that's a wrong translation because I was prone to think that there should be a much better verse. There's a much better verse that we could have said. There's a verse in the Torah that says, any non-priest is not allowed to go, anyone except for the high priest is not allowed to go into the Holy of Holies, right? They saw a fox emerging from the Holy of Holies. If you want to highlight how holy that space is, and therefore that would increase the violation of that space, you don't bring the verse that says only priests are allowed to serve in the temple. What you should say is nobody, even the priests, are allowed to go into the Holy of Holies except one priest on Yom Kippur. That would be a better verse to highlight the holiness of this space. So why did Rabbi Akiva, quote unquote, evoke the wrong verse? Why did he take a verse that does not make that point as strong as he could have? Right? Because it's a verse that says clearly, even a high priest, none of the priests can go in, but even a high priest is not allowed to go into the temple, to the Holy of Holies, if it's not Yom Kippur. So that's the third question. Again, if I'm not clear, if you have any questions, jump in. Please don't hesitate to stop me.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah.
Question.
Well, when I made the invitation, I was just joking. No, I'm kidding.
Why? Well, is it allegorical that they talk about foxes rather than any other animal?
I don't think maybe it's allegorical, maybe, but it probably was practical as well. In other words, maybe there's an allegorical meaning as well, but there was also probably practical as well. And in that part of the world, you would see foxes, I think it was practical as well.
So it wasn't an indication that maybe these were the Romans that were wandering over there.
It could be that's a deeper meaning. It could be. I'm not going to say that it doesn't have. Again, there's obviously layers of meaning. It could be that the fox represents, fox is considered to be the most clever of the animals.
Yeah.
So a shrewd, I would say, the most shrewd of the animals. So it could be the fox has symbolic meaning as well. But the fox, if you're in the Middle East, and there is area that's not settled, the foxes will intrude, and that happens until today. Until today in Israel, you would see some wild animals, amongst them foxen, if that's a word.
Got it. Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you. Okay, that's question 3. We still have to get to question 8 before we could continue. Don't worry, we're not going to get to an answer today. Don't worry. I don't want to raise your hopes. Okay, question number 4. Rabbi Akiva says, unless the bad prophecy happens, I would have not known that the good prophecy would happen. What is that even supposed to mean? There's a general rule that if God promises something good, it has to happen. Right? We spoke about this in the laws of prophecy. If a prophet says something bad is going to happen, it may or may not happen. Why? Because God could change his mind and forgive. Right? The famous story of Jonah. God sends Jonah to Nineveh, and he says that in 40 days Nineveh will be overturned. And you know what? Nineveh was not overturned. Does that mean Jonah is a false prophet? No, it means that God is a forgiving and compassionate God. However, the law is, we actually read about it in next week's parsha, that if a prophet says that something good is going to happen and it does not happen, he's a false prophet. Because something good, if God promises something good, it's for sure going to happen. That's the general rule. So what is Rabbi Akiva telling me? I'm so happy that I see the fox coming out of the Holy of Holies, because that's proof that the good prophecy is going to come true. Good prophecies have to come true anyway. Isn't that an axiom? You know, we know anything that God says is going to happen, even if it's for the good, it has to happen. So what does it mean that Rabbi Akiva says? If not for the bad prophecy, I would not have known that the good prophecy would happen. So that's another question on this link that Rabbi Akiva says, I need the bad prophecy to occur for the good prophecy to occur. What does one have to do with the other? That's question number 4. Question number 5. Of all the verses that Rabbi Akiva could have quoted to say that there's a bad prophecy, the bad prophecy will occur, that the destruction of a temple will occur. And as a result of that, the fox will emerge from the Holy of Holies. Of all the prophecies he could have evoked, he evokes one. What does he say? He says, therefore, for your sake, which is really because of you, Zion shall be plowed as a field. As a result of Zion is plowed as a field. That's a verse that describes destruction. As a result, the foxes are going to be found there. But there are so many other and previous earlier verses in all the prophecies, including Uriah, that discuss the destruction. So of all of the examples that Rabbi Akiva could have evoked of a negative prophecy, he quotes the one, Zion will be plowed like a field. What is the significance of that? Again, the premise, most people study the piece of Talmud and they say it's a wonderful story. We finished a Masechta, we finished a tractate, time to take out the scotch, time to take out the vodka, to say l'chaim and eat the herring. No, but every detail, the premise over here, our premise, the Rebbe's premise is that every detail is precise. And if Rabbi Akiva is going to evoke this verse, it's because this verse is critical to understand the message of Rabbi Akiva. So the questions don't seem that profound because usually we're not bothered by these types of questions. It's just a detail. But once you analyze it and you see, and we'll get to the answer, then we'll come back and see how all these questions are the key to unlock the deeper meaning. And yes, Rabbi Akiva could not have evoked another verse. He had to evoke this verse because only this verse describing the temple, describing the destruction in this way is able to allow us to understand the deep meaning of Rabbi Akiva. So that was question number 5. Why specifically this verse? Question number 6. Why does the Talmud list the names of the sages who were with Rabbi Akiva? In other times, when the Talmud wants to, in other times when the Talmud wants to say a story, when you have multiple sages conversing with one sage, it usually says, once upon a time, there was a rabbi who was going with the other rabbis. For example, Rabbi Tarfon, who was the colleague of Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon was with this Canaan, was with the elders. Elders is synonymous for scholars. You could have said Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues, Rabbi Akiva and the sages were walking to Rome. Rabbi Akiva and the sages were walking to the Temple Mountain. No, in this case, we spelled out exactly who it was. Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and who was the last guy, and Rabbi Yeshua. We need to know the names. Again, is that significant? The answer is yes. What is the significance? We'll see. That's question number 6. Number 7. Oh, this is very interesting. This is actually very interesting. Why did this is funny. Why did the sages tell Rabbi Akiva, okay, we have this debate. Rabbi Akiva laughs and they cry. And they say, why are you crying? Why are you laughing? And he explains it to them. After the first story, what happened? Nothing happened. Did they agree? Did they buy into Rabbi Akiva's philosophy? No. Did they say, Akiva, you comforted us? No. The second story, only in the second story do they say, Akiva, you comforted us. So now 1 second. If Rabbi Akiva was so persuasive that he comforted them in the second part, in the second story, which actually is a greater calamity, to see the destruction of a temple, to see what's worse, to see Rome sitting in peace, or seeing the actual fox coming from the place of the Holy of Holies, which represents the absolute raising of Zion, a complete destruction. I would think the second story is much more painful. And actually, I would think the opposite would happen. But what happens is the first story, it doesn't say that they didn't tell Akiva, you comforted us. Say, okay, this guy is strange. He's laughing. He sees the Romans' success and he's laughing. Okay, he has a theory why he's laughing. But it doesn't say that they were comforted. And whereas the second story, only in the second story, they told Rabbi Akiva, you comforted us. That's question 7. And question 8 is a detail of question 7. And that is, what does it mean? The Talmud says they used this precise language. We even had it in the English. Baloshan hazeh amrulai. They spoke to him in this precise language. The Gemara adds, the sages sent to him employing this formulation. Akiva, you have comforted us. Akiva, you have comforted us. In other words, why do they have to say, why did they say it twice? And why does the Talmud say they gave this exact formula? Akiva, you comforted us. Akiva, you comforted us. Now, I'm going to go, I don't know if we'll continue too much today, right? Too much today, but I just want to address this 8th question because there is a commentary called the Maharsha, which is an acronym of his name. And he is one of the only commentators that are printed in the back of the Talmud that addresses not only the legal part of the Talmud, but also the stories of the Talmud. In his commentary, they have sort of, when I was growing up, there were 2 different font sizes. And the regular font was for his commentary on the legal part of Talmud, which is very deep. And then he also comments in a smaller font. Of course, in his days, there was the same font, but not by the time I came around, it was a smaller font. And he has the commentaries on the stories. And when we were kids, we were in high school, we would love to peek because the Maharsha, if he has small font, it means a good story is coming, and it was sort of lighter and more interesting for the heart. So so the Maharsha addresses questions 7 and 8. What does the Maharsha say? Remember, we had 2 questions. 2 questions were, how come, question 7 was, how come the sages told Rabbi Akiva, you comforted us in the second story, not on the first story? That was question 7. Question 8 is, why did they say double language? Akiva, you comforted us. Akiva, you comforted us. Says the Maharsha. Maybe Vicky wants to say. What did the Maharsha say? Go ahead. I think you can guess.
Well, yeah, the guess that the answers both scenarios at the same time, because by plowing, it's even more harsh. So that's why it kind of addresses both scenarios.
Okay, so you're onto something, but you're going way higher. I want to stay simpler, but you're right. He says simply, why does it say twice? It refers to both stories. Right? Question 8 is why repeat? Why do they say, Akiva, you comforted us? Akiva, you comforted us. The answer is because one was for story 2 and one was for story 1. And that answers question 7 of how come they didn't say, Akiva, you comforted us? Because really they did at the end of the second story. That's the Maharsha's answer, which is a wonderful answer. But the Rebbe says, 1 second, it's not such a good answer. Why not? Because these stories did not happen consecutively. It didn't happen 5 minutes after the other. When we read the story, it sounds like, yeah, they happen one after the other. And when they say twice in the second story, you comforted us, one is for the second, one's for the first. But really, there's a tremendous amount of time. I don't know how much, but certainly a few weeks in between these 2 stories. Because you can't travel from Rome to Jerusalem in a half an hour. And in any case, and so 2 different stories. So what are you telling me? You're telling me that they did not tell Akiva, you comforted us in this first story because they were relying on that the second story is going to occur. There was no second story at the time. Second story is weeks later at a minimum. So that's why the question of the Maharsha is not so. The question of the Maharsha, the answer of the Maharsha is not the greatest answer. So we're still left with question 7 and question 8, which is basically, why were they comforted specifically in the second story, not the first story? Okay, so this is what we did so far. So far we had the story, the 2 stories really, and we had 8 questions. So with that, I don't want to just send you home with questions. So I'm going to start giving a little bit of the explanation. It's not going to address these questions directly, but it's going to sort of give background into the story in general. And then we'll call it a day and we'll continue next Wednesday, God willing. But the point is, everything I'm going to say today, we're going to question next week. In other words, it's a building. We have a little interpretation, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. That's really, or really 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We're going to start explaining, and then we're going to get to more questions. But I want to send you off with something interesting. So let's start with the beginning of the explanation. So what is really the difference between Rabbi Akiva and the other sages? So what do we know about Rabbi Akiva? So the Talmud says that Rabbi Akiva would always say, in the Aramaic, he would say as follows: a person should always say that whatever God does is for the good, which is a very radical statement. Just because you heard the statement before doesn't mean it's not radical. But anything happens to you, you say, whatever God does is for the good. And there's fascinating stories about this in the Talmud, explaining how Rabbi Akiva would do it. And there's an interesting story that the Rebbe doesn't quote here, but it's in the Talmud. And it's basically the story is that Rabbi Akiva said, once upon a time, he was traveling, and when he would travel, he needed a few things to travel. He needed a donkey to carry his suitcase. He needed a rooster for an alarm clock because he had to wake up early to study Torah. And he needed a candle to be able to study the Torah at night. And once upon a time, he comes to this town, and nobody would take him in as a guest. So he had no choice but to sleep outside. And then what happens is, it was outside, so there were wild beasts, and both the donkey and the rooster were attacked by other animals and killed. And then the wind came and blew out his candle, and he was sitting alone in the darkness. And he said, everything that God does is for the good. In other words, and then the story ends that night that city was attacked, and all the people were taken captive, and Rabbi Akiva was spared. So it turns out that if he had the donkey and he had the rooster and he had the light, he would have been found by the attackers. And the fact that something that looked to be bad, he's sitting outside alone at night in the dark, turned out to be for the good. And that was a story, case in point, where Rabbi Akiva was able to see that his motto of everything that God does is for the good. He was able to see in that scenario how indeed everything God does is for the good. So what do we see here? We see that's Rabbi Akiva's philosophy, that's his worldview. Now let's think about how that applies to this story. The other sages, so basically Rabbi Akiva is consistent with his philosophy. The other sages, when they see a scenario, they look at the scenario and they see, what do we see before our eyes? And before our eyes, we see destruction. Before our eyes, we see negativity. Before our eyes, we see that the enemy is prospering. And that's bad, and that's why we're going to cry. Rabbi Akiva says everything God does is for the good. Doesn't mean it's good now. It's another discussion if it's good now. That's another discussion. That's a different discussion. But the Rabbi Akiva is not saying that radical. That other people say, and that's true too. But Rabbi Akiva says everything God does is for the good. Litav, literally to the good. That's future tense. Everything that God does, even if it's bad now, is going to lead to something good. So Rabbi Akiva is focused on the future. No matter what happens now, he's never looking at the present, he's always looking at the future. So when he says the negativity, when he sees the negativity, he doesn't see the negativity. He sees the negativity as it will then lead to something good in the future, and therefore he laughs. And that's why in both those stories, what does he see? He says, if the people who go against God's will are prosper, how much more so? This tells me that in the future, we're going to prosper. Okay, he's looking in the future. And so too, if the destruction occurred and the temple was raised and the temple was plowed, so now for sure I know that in the future, old men and women are going to be sitting in Jerusalem. So Rabbi Akiva is consistent with his philosophy, and this is the big debate. The other sages are saying, when you face a problem, when you want to evaluate reality, when you want to evaluate whether something is good or bad, if you want to evaluate if you should be happy or sad, if you want to evaluate if you should be mourning or rejoicing, look at what you have before your eyes. You have to live in reality. Rabbi Akiva says, no, you have to look at the future. And the future would impact your present. And if the future is positive, you can laugh. And that's the big debate between Rabbi Akiva and the other sages. So that's the beautiful answer, and that's already enough. If we stop reading the essay here, it's already enough. But we're not done yet, and we're going to insist. The Rebbe insists that's not enough. Why not? Because Rabbi Akiva should have said that. Instead of giving this whole speech, he should have said his main points. He should have said that, look, I believe that everything God does is for the good in the future, and something good will happen, and then he should have explained. Rabbi Akiva in the story is not evoking his overarching philosophy. So what we're going to get to later is we're going to say that this is not exactly the same point. These two stories actually add on Rabbi Akiva's other point that everything God does is for the good. This story has even more insight and more depth, which we're going to get to next week. But again, even if you don't come back next week, you have two stories, and it's a very interesting question. Two groups of rabbis. And the majority of the rabbis say, you want to evaluate the scenario, you look at the present. And Rabbi Akiva says, you look at the future. And the future has the power to impact your present. And therefore, your mood and your state of mind and your evaluation of reality must take the future into consideration. That is the big debate between the two. And next week, God willing, in good health, we will continue the analysis of the story. I hope you can join us. Have a wonderful day. Go ahead, Vicky.
I just had a question, the ninth question.
Yeah.
So I don't know if Rebbe addresses that in the answers. It's very difficult to project far in the future because it's open-dated future. Does he address that?
So Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Akiva does not say that. Rabbi Akiva doesn't say that I'm happy because I know how it's going to work out, or I know the date when it's going to work out. Right? Look at the story of all the stories that Rabbi Akiva's entire life. There was one event that he was able to see how the present bad led to good. The story with it when he was sitting alone. But in general, it was an act of faith. And Rabbi Akiva had a terrible life, and of course, his end was terrible. He was killed by the Romans for teaching Torah. So it wasn't like his life had a happy ending. And if there was a happy ending, it would be in the world to come. So it's for Rabbi Akiva, it's an act of faith. Rabbi Akiva says, look, you have to believe. You don't know this, but you have to believe. You don't see it, but you have to believe that everything God does will lead to good. And that knowledge itself, even though you don't have the date and you don't have the promise and you can't put it on your calendar of when and how it's going to turn to good, but that faith itself is enough to put you in a state of joy. Now, sometimes we're lucky enough when we're able to see how the negativity leads to good. Sometimes something bad happened, you thought it was bad, and then in retrospect is the best thing that happened to you in your life. Other times you don't see it. You don't know. You don't know how it leads to good. And it looks like it's just pain. Well, we don't know the whole picture. We don't know what's in the afterlife. We don't know about other incarnations. So yeah, we're not sure. We don't know. But the point here is the faith. Rabbi Akiva was saying, if a person will always say means always in all scenarios, which means it's an act of faith. You don't always see how that happens.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun for me, so I appreciate your joining.
Toda Rabbi.
Toda Rabbi. Be well.
Have a good day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
You too. Thank you.